So the REACH regulation has changed the way we conduct the risk assessment for chemicals, and basically has three main actors. First, industry, which now is responsible for conduct the risk assessment for each chemical that they manufacture or put in the market. And this is done through the pre-registration, data sharing, and the key element with this, the registration of chemicals. All chemicals above 1 ton should be registered, either manufactured or imported in the EU. The second key players are the agency, the European Chemicals Agency in Helsinki, plus the member states that conduct the evaluation of the dossier, as well as the evaluation of the scientific quality of the substances. And finally is the Commission and the authorities with the authorities in the member states that take the final decision regarding the authorization of some chemicals that are of high concern, the restriction in the case that the risk assessment concludes that there is a potential risk that is assumed to be unacceptable, and therefore a restriction is needed, as well as for the harmonized classification and labeling. The philosophy and the principles of REACH and CLP. CLP is the classification and labeling part, which it was a chapter of REACH, is to ensure a high level of protection for human health and the environment. And the key element is the responsibility or the burden of the proof is moved from the authorities to industry. And not industry in general. Each company has the obligation to register the substances that they manufacture or they import in the EU. That means that for any chemical that is manufactured by 10 different companies, we will need to have 10 registration numbers, because it's the substance in the market. What's relevant is not necessarily the chemical name of the substance. It's not perfect, obviously, nothing is perfect, but nevertheless represent a huge change when compared with the previous legislation, that chemicals were put in the market basically only with a minor assessment. For the new chemicals, that the situation was different, but for the old chemicals, they were put in the market, and then you just wait to see if there were effects in human health and the environment. That is not the case now. And get the information on the properties of the substances. And in order to be able to cover the huge amount of chemicals that were in the European market, we have some deadlines for getting the information, and promotes the use of alternative methods for assessing chemicals in order to reduce the use of vertebrate animals. The first step of the risk assessment is conducted directly by industry, and it's the REACH registration process. Is the key element. We have received a already significant number of dossiers from industry, and as I have already mentioned, through a process that has been coordinated with the OECD in the Euclid format, industry provide the information on the chemical, all the hazard information, physical chemical properties, composition, and so on, include the information that is available, and suggest testing proposals in the case that the information is not available, and have the submission under the REACH IT. In the case of companies that put on the market over 10 tons per year, in addition to the basic information, there is a request for a chemical safety report that is not other thing but the outcome of the risk assessment conducted by industry to demonstrate that the substance is safe for human health as well as for the environment. For registration for the chemicals already in the EU market, there were three key registration deadlines. You can see that now we are between the first and the second. So basically, all chemicals in the EU market that are manufactured or imported about 1,000 tons has been already registered, as well as chemicals that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic for reproduction, over 1 ton, and chemicals with a long-term concern for the environment, this R5053 classification, over 1,000 tons. That is the information already available, and as you will see, disseminated by ECHA. In May 2013, we are expecting the second batch of dossiers for chemicals between 100 and 1,000 tons, and finally by 2018, all chemicals in the EU market will be registered. The chemical safety assessment contains all the information. Start with the identification of the hazardous properties of the substance, based on the classification and labeling, currently under the CLP, as well as the identification of the substance as persistent, bioaccumulated, or toxic, or of equivalent concern that include endocrine disrupting chemicals. There is a determination of denols that are the concentration that are assumed to be safe for humans, as well as PNEX that are the equivalent for the environment. So for the company need to propose the concentrations for the exposure of workers, consumers, citizens, and the environment that are proposed to be safe. And obviously there are guidance for industry on how this need to be assessed. And also there is an exposure scenario for each use, and the use is described by 5 descriptors. So the use of the substances need to go to the detail that the way in which the substance will be used by the company as well by any intermediate users, and the risk management measures are very, very clear in the registration dossier. Then the key element from the agency is to disseminate the information. And if you enter into the webpage of the agency, you will see already the information for over 4,000 substances that represent over 25,000 dossiers from individual chemicals. The information is already available and obviously is free. Again, you need to consider, as a caveat, this is the information provided by industry. Has not been assessed by the authorities in the member states, has not been assessed by the agency, is the information provided by industry. In addition to the information on registration, you will see the information of every chemical that is marketed in the EU, and that's covered 3 million notifications from industry, covering about 90,000 different substances. And there is no limit for the tonnage here. So every substance that is marketed in the EU and is considered hazardous substances need to be there and is in the inventory that, again, is publicly available, free for everybody, not only in Europe, but in the world. What we have also an issue for confidentiality. There has been, there are elements in the dossier that can be claimed confidential. The data are here, about 1,700 confidential claims by end of last year, and we are already in the process for the assessment. So each confidential claim needs to be justified, and then the agency has a process to decide, okay, that is according to the law, you are allowed to have this confidential or not. One of the key elements is that if you enter now in the web page, the name of the registrant, so the industry that is the manufacturer or importer, is not yet there, but there has been an agreement that will be published unless claimed confidential and accepted as confidential. So relatively soon, you will see also not only the substances, but also which companies produce the substance in the EU or import the substance in the EU from abroad. And there is obviously a clear involvement from all stakeholders that cover industry, but obviously also NGOs, to see how we can improve the friendly use of the information. The current information dissemination portal is based on the Euclid database, which is an OECD tool, but nevertheless you need to enter substance by substance. So we are discussing now how this information can be used by the scientific community, as well as be presented in a much more clear way to the citizens. The second step is the assessment of the information that has been provided by industry. And this is the evaluation process. And basically the agency is responsible for the evaluation of the dossiers, the dossier for every company, through the examination of the testing proposals and the compliance check. And the member state authorities are responsible for the evaluation of the substances. So they identify some substances that are of high concern, cover the information presented not by a company, but all the companies that have information or have marketed or have a registration for this particular substance, and then provide the real risk assessment or evaluation of the real risk assessment for these substances. What is the current situation? in the compliance check, the legislation forced ECA to cover at least 5% of the dossiers for each tonnage band. Obviously, the registration deadline is relatively close for us, and we are working quite hard to fit on this 5%, and hopefully we will be able to succeed. And the expectation is that we will not just fix in the 5%, but we will try to address and to have the compliance check of as many dossiers as possible. The current situation can be summarized in this data. From a total of about 150 dossiers, you see that in the large majority, over 100, we observe elements that need to be modified, and there is a final decision to the company. You need to improve the dossier. The quality of the dossier has been not as expected, so we are trying to enforce and to convince the industry to improve the quality of the dossiers. And in this sense, I will mention particularly the figures in green. There were 12 dossiers that we considered that there were no actions, so were absolutely in line with the expectations, but also 10 dossiers that were outdated by industry because of the opening the process, and informally we inform the industry, okay, you have some data gaps or you have some problems in the dossier, and on a voluntary basis, industry just started to improve the quality of the dossiers. What are the key elements that we have observed in this assessment? First is the identification and the composition of the substance. In some cases, it's quite easy because it's a chemical, pure chemical. In other cases, petroleum products or others are quite complicated substances, and the identity of the substance is not so clear. From the human health perspective, the key elements that we have observed, requests for additional information or not sufficient justifications, are for in vitro gene mutations in bacteria, prenatal developmental toxicity, as well as the denal derivation, so the concentration that the industry assumes is safe for workers, consumers, and citizens. And for the environment, the equivalent value, this PNEC for the environmental hazard assessment, and then effects on aquatic plants and aquatic invertebrates. The second step of the evaluation by ECA is testing proposals. Again, in this case, all testing proposals need to be examined, and you can see here some of the results. We are in the evaluation of about 2,000 testing proposals, about 600 were evaluated last year, and in many of the cases the proposal was accepted. And again, to see which kind of elements has been presented, you can see that subchronic toxicity studies as well as prenatal developmental toxicity are among the key elements that has been requested and accepted. So, in other words, one of the key data gaps in the current situation should be toxicity for reproductive effects. And through the process of compliance check and the process of the testing proposals, we are expecting to improve the amount of information on reproductive effects quite soon. Regarding the substance evaluation, it's the responsibility of the member states, and they have already decided to cover 91 substances between this year and 2014, and they have 1 year for conducting the evaluation, and the first evaluation are already ongoing and will be presented to the member state committee in ECA next year. One of the key elements is of REACH, obviously, is then to improve the problem that has been observed through the registration and the evaluation with 3 key elements: the harmonization of classification and labeling, authorization, and restrictions. The harmonization of the classification and labeling obliges industry to use a particular classification. In principle, the idea is that industry should clarify what are the hazards of the substance and apply the criteria in the CLP to classify the substances. But nevertheless, there is a possibility that the authorities do not agree, or that some companies, they observe that other companies are not classifying the substances properly. And then companies, as well as the authorities in the EU, have the possibility to request that the substance need an harmonized classification that becomes obligatory for all the companies in the EU market. And there has been already over 200 proposals, both those that are in the registry of intention as well as submitted. And the proposals are handled by the Committee for Risk Assessment that has already adopted opinions on 49 substances that proposing what the harmonized classification should be. The authorization covered the substances that has been identified of very high concern, that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, and toxic for reproduction substances, PBTs, and substances with equivalent level of concerns as endocrine disrupting chemicals, and the candidate list of substances already identified of very high concern has currently 73 substances, and there are 13 under consultation. And from this candidate list, the substances has been prioritized and proposed for the Commission to include in Annex 14, and that means that the industry cannot use the substance unless they receive a specific authorization for a particular use, and there are 14 substances already in the process. And finally, the restrictions. When the authorization is not sufficient, it's not sufficient to give an authorization. The risk for the human health or the environment is so high that there is a need to restrict the use of the chemical. Then there is a process. All the restrictions are from previous legislation are already reached in Annex 17, and there are 6 substances which are currently under restrictions, and the Annex 17 will be revised quite soon, because of the opinions of the committees of ECHA for 2 substances already adopted last year. But what are the challenges and the opportunities to a realistic, integrated, and combined risk assessment? RICH is basically a process to request industry to present information for every substance, and also to the authorities in ECHA, as well as the Commission and the Member States, to decide on that. But the key element is that each company addresses the risk of their substances. The Member States, ECHA, and they check the quality and consider under REACH and CLP community-wide measures. The Member States address national, regional, and local priorities, and this is not substance by substance. The key element is what is the combination of the effects of chemicals. Every of us do not receive, we are not exposed to a single chemical, we are exposed to a combination. And obviously the same element is for all ecosystems. The risk assessment substance by substance is important, but it's not sufficient. And as you know, there are some elements in the currently under discussion on how to address the combination of effects of chemicals. And following the proposal from the Commission requests a report, the Environment requests a report to Professor Corterham, and the SANCO requested the scientific committees under SANCO to evaluate the scientific quality of that report. The key element in the report contracted by the Environment is that even when all components in the mixture of a substance have diverse mode of action, they are present, they may produce potential risk even when present in individual NOELs or NOECs. The assessment by the European scientific committees is that basically in biology 1 by 1 is not necessarily 2. You have many different possibilities, and if not, you just can put 2 rabbits and just wait. How we can we estimate these effects? And that's the key element. And the conclusion is that in 2 cases, for the similar mechanism of action and for similar mechanism of action, yes, we can. We have mathematical equations for cover that. In the case of antagonisms and synergism, we have to consider case by case. They are not general approaches. The conclusion from the scientific committee is that basically when the chemicals are under the DINER or the regulatory no effects, there is a possibility to assess the information. If there are the chemicals with different mode of actions, there is no robust evidence that the combined effect of those chemicals may be relevant. But nevertheless, when the chemicals have the same mechanism of action, it's clear that the risk assessment should be done jointly for all the chemicals with the same mechanism of action. The risk assessment committee, the risk assessment committees has proposed 3 for the assessment of mixtures. And the key element is, okay, we have the scientific information, we have the methods, we have the proposed for setting priorities, but where is the information that we need for assessing the chemicals? And let's see what the information that is required. We need the hazard information for each chemical, and then we need to consider the exposure in the workplace, the exposure from consumer articles, and the exposure from the environment and the different conditions. And if we are able to identify the combined exposure for each citizen, or at least each subpopulation, depending on the location that the citizen is living, the location that the person is working, the working conditions, as well as the kind of consumer articles that he or she is exposed, we will be able to try to assess the risk of the realistic combination of chemicals each person is exposed. And where is the information? This is the information generated by REACH. Again, it's substance by substance, but we have the information already for almost 5,000 substances. The information in green, and we will not enter into the details, is already published. You can access that information in the web page. The information in red is confidential information, but already available to the authorities in the European Union as well as in the Commission. And the key element is that the information is also structured in a way that is relatively simple to identify the key elements and to use these elements in the combined assessment. And finally, let me present to you some personal considerations, not at all the consideration of the agency. You see the disclaimer of my presentation in the first slide. In my personal view, REACH and CLP offer now unique possibilities for addressing the real chemical risk of European citizens as well as the environment. The substance approach of REACH is essential, but not necessarily sufficient. And the scientific community needs to take a new perspective based on the available information. In the past, all the effects of combined substances were limited to tens of substances, 100 substances at the maximum, and the limitation of the main limitation were the use of the substance, how the substances are used, as well as the hazard information of the substance. That the limitation has disappeared. The information is already publicly available. But obviously, we need to modify the risk assessment. We cannot conduct a normal risk assessment for 10,000 substances. We need to modify that, and the scientific community has now the responsibility to develop a new concept, a new paradigm for risk assessment, trying to identify which elements will be relevant, which substances will be relevant, depending on the living and behavior of each person in the EU, and try to identify what should be the priorities. So if we can respond the key element, the combined, or the key question, the combined effect of chemicals is causing negative effects, the answer is in some cases. Not always, but clearly in some cases. And the challenge is to answer and to identify in which cases, and to provide a scientifically sound quantitative assessment for the REACH. In my view, that was very difficult, if not impossible in the past, because of the lack of information. But now the information is there, and what we need to do to move is the science. It's impossible to try to conduct with the current risk assessment paradigms the assessment of 5,000 chemicals with the information already available, 10,000 chemicals in a few years, 30,000, 40,000 chemicals by 2018. And the proposal should be to have an EU-wide scientific network involving all relevant parties to address millions or billions of data using the omics part, and to develop something like a risk omic to develop a realistic assessment, not worst case, realistic assessment of the risk for human health and the environment for the combination of chemicals we are exposed. And in order to do that, we need to have the cooperation of, obviously, industry, the authorities, and obviously citizens as well. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.